Hi, everyone. My name is Audrey Mentz. I'm a partner at Thompson Coburn, and I am presenting today's webinar, Convinced Your Company Can't Possibly Be benefiting from or promoting human trafficking. Think again. Thank you all for coming today. But before we begin, I want to address a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget located at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer these questions during the webcast, but if a more in-depth answer is needed, or if we run out of time, we will answer them later via email. The webinar is streaming via the internet. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, check the help widget located at the bottom of your screen or hit F5. This webinar is CLE accredited in California and Illinois for 1 hour of general CLE credit, and in Missouri for 1.2 hours of general CLE credit. We award CLE based on attendance for the entire 60 minutes. From time to time, you will be required to click a pop-up screen to reflect your continued engagement. At the end of the program, click on the certification widget at the bottom, which will show you if you will be awarded CLE credit. Then fill out the survey. As a note, once you leave the certification widget, you cannot go back, so make sure you wrap all of that up before you move on to the survey. Your certificate of attendance will be emailed to you in about 2 hours. And we value your opinions and appreciate your participation in the course. All right, so let's dive right in. Today we're going to be discussing human trafficking in supply chains, in labor forces, and more, and how your company could potentially be liable for trafficking. And I know that when most people think of human trafficking, movies like Taken come to mind, and you think of the exploitation of young girls in foreign countries. And that is certainly a big issue, but human trafficking is a much bigger problem than that, and it is occurring everywhere. It's occurring all over the United States. It's a problem here in Chicago, and I think the recent news with Jeffrey Epstein is a really good indication of this. It is a ubiquitous problem. So before we get into the meat of the webinar, I have a couple of scenarios to think about, things that potentially could render people liable for human trafficking that you wouldn't be thinking about. So, first scenario, a U.S. company is in the business of selling goods made from cloth woven in Togo, Africa. One of the employees of the U.S. company has reason to believe that the weavers are poorly paid and forced to work long hours in grueling conditions. Do the weavers in Togo have a claim against the U.S. company? Another scenario, a minor is using a dating website here in the U.S. to elicit customers for commercial sex. Could that website potentially be liable for trafficking? Our third, reminiscent of recent news with the raids in Mississippi, but a U.S. poultry processing plant opts to hire undocumented workers for significantly less pay to save on labor costs. Do the workers have a claim against the factory? These are all scenarios that hopefully by the end of this CLE, you'll have a clear understanding of what people might be liable for and might not. So our general agenda for the day, first we're going to start with just a broad description of what human trafficking is and all of the activities that it encompasses. Number two, what are the applicable laws? 3, how may a company be liable for human trafficking? 4th, what can companies do to identify and mitigate trafficking? And then 5th, what are the legal and social ramifications for failing to tackle human trafficking? So let's start with what is human trafficking? And I want to preface this with this definition that I've provided here. This is a general definition. It pretty fairly encompasses the concept, although each statutory framework has its own definition. So it's important to know that you need to be paying close attention to whatever statutes you are looking at. But generally, human trafficking is the use of coercion, abduction, fraud, or deception to recruit, transport, transfer, harbor, or receive persons for the purpose of unlawful exploitation. Note that this definition, and pretty much all definitions, they do not require that you actually move people. Typically think of people being abducted in one country and trafficked over to another country. That's not necessarily the case. A person could be born in Chicago, raised in Chicago, and become a trafficking victim here in Chicago. Okay, so let's unpack this definition a little bit. It's typically, when people talk about defining human trafficking, we divide it into three categories. So what is the action? So in that definition I just provided you, there are a variety of actions: recruit, transport, transfer, or harbor, or receive. The means by which that action is accomplished, so coercion, abduction, fraud, or deception, and the purpose, which is unlawful exploitation. Let's delve into the purpose a little bit more. So what constitutes unlawful exploitation? The first category, and this is a very massive category, forced labor. And this would include involuntary servitude, debt bondage, peonage, slavery, and child labor. It's important to note that this does not require that there be no payment. There can be people that are paid that are still victims of trafficking. There are more victims of trafficking, in particular forced labor, today than at any other point in human history. And estimates put the number of trafficked victims globally between 20 and 40 million people. Nearly 70% of today's labor force is found in the private sector, mostly in labor-intensive industries such as manufacturing, fishing, agriculture, domestic work, and construction. The next category, and this is the one that I think comes to people's minds most often, is sexual exploitation. And this has always been a problem, and it's on the rise today because people are able to take advantage of online platforms in order to traffic men and women. One important thing to note, and this is true of forced labor and sexual exploitation, because you see it there, we have child labor. So under sexual exploitation, if a minor is technically consenting, and I know that's a very sticky term when we're talking about minors, but if they are consenting and they are minors, it is still trafficking. And again, child labor, it doesn't matter if you're paying children, child labor, that is trafficking. And then the third category I have, and this is a much smaller category, and it is addressed in some of the statutes. Some of them are silent on this, but organ trafficking. As much as 10% of all organ donations involved trafficked organs, and typically these are coming from one of two categories of people. One, impoverished individuals who are literally willing to sell organs in order to survive. And then the bigger category is victims of kidnapping and murder, and this is particularly true with children. Most of the trafficked organs are essentially coming from murdered children, so it is a very big issue. And I put this up here, this world map of modern slavery in 2018, from 2018. No surprise, a lot of the most problematic countries: India, China, Iran, Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo. But you'll note that the U.S. there's an estimated 100 to 500,000 victims just right here in the U.S. And again, some of those people have been brought in, but a lot of them are U.S. citizens. So who is particularly vulnerable to trafficking? Really, everyone. I mean, trafficked victims include people of all races, nationalities, ages, genders, but there are categories of people who are most vulnerable. And typically these vulnerabilities stem from immigration status, language barriers, economic hardship, political instability, natural disasters, and displacement. And these are good things to keep in mind as we go forward talking about supply chains and labor forces, because these are easy things to pay attention to that could potentially be red flags that your company can pay attention to. Okay, so based on that general description of human trafficking, you're probably thinking, well, my company is not in the business of trafficking people or their organs, so how can we potentially be liable for human trafficking? And the answer here in the United States, well, there are a couple of answers, but the big one is called the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This is a federal statute, and it imposes liability on both people and entities that knowingly benefit from participation in a venture that that person or entity knew or should have known involves trafficking. And that definition really, or that description includes two parts. So the knowingly benefit, and essentially, if your company is deriving any type of benefit, so typically we think of profit, so any type of profit from a venture, and the entity or the person knew or should have known that that venture involved trafficking, that exposes them to liability. And the important thing to note is that this is both criminal liability and civil liability. So if a person or entity meets those two categories, federal prosecutors could be coming after them, but also trafficking victims, because one thing that this act does is it grants a private right of action to trafficking victims. They are permitted to come file lawsuits in federal court here in the U.S. against any U.S. companies that violate this statute. Importantly, the trafficking need not occur in the U.S. So if we think back about that scenario that we talked about at the very beginning, those workers that are weaving the cloth in Togo, Africa, they could come potentially file suit here in the U.S. Now, of course, they need to know this statute exists, and they need to have some means of filing suit. So there are obviously some roadblocks, but the liability is there. Another big part of this statute, employee knowledge can be imputed to employers. So if you have employees that are aware of the issue and they do not report it up, that could still be corporate liability. And then it's pretty clear under the statute that it allows for claims against third parties, such as investors, lenders, developers, suppliers. So again, these are the entities that were knowingly benefiting. They were making money off of these ventures and either knew or should have known that there was trafficking involved. So this is really the big statute here in the U.S. There are other statutes that relate to trafficking. So I have two additional statutes up here. The first one is the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, and this basically, it prohibits all products made by forced labor, including child labor, from being imported into the United States. And the important thing about this act is it repealed the consumptive demand clause, which previously had provided that if the demand for goods in the U.S. exceeded the amount that could be supplied by producers, that where there's a verification that there was no forced labor, if demand exceeded that, then for certain products, the products could be imported from locations where there were questions about forced labor. So that was called the consumptive demand clause. It is no longer good law. This act prohibits the importing of any goods made by or products produced with forced labor. I will say, though, having talked with people in our office, because I will say import-export law, it's not my area. Robert Shapiro in our DC office, he's a guru on this, and if you have questions, you're certainly welcome to follow up with him. He says that while this could potentially have teeth, it's not being treated in such a way. So essentially, entities are required to certify that they are not importing goods made by forced labor, but there's not much, or at least currently, there isn't a lot of follow-up on the validity of those statements. So this, doesn't have a huge impact today. That doesn't mean it might not have a huge impact tomorrow. And then I've also included the Banking Secrecy Act, and this is a statute aimed at curbing money laundering. And I have included this just to make everyone aware that there are plenty of statutes out there that are industry specific that touch on this issue. So obviously, trafficking as an illegal activity, or money launderers, or any, I would say, any criminal activity that this act is aimed at curbing. It could implicate traffickers. So it's just important to realize that there are plenty of statutes out there that aren't on their face. They do not appear to be directly addressing human trafficking, but they do in a roundabout way. And if people have specific questions about their industries, we will be happy to answer those. We haven't included everything up here just because we only have an hour. And then there are plenty of other federal statutes that also, they address this issue, but it's more head-on. So if your company is not in the business of trafficking people or organs, which I very much hope that is the case for everyone listening today, these statutes are not relevant to your business. But for instance, we have the Fair Labor Standards Act, Alien Tort Claims Act, the Mann Act, and the PROTECT Act, which is aimed at mostly protecting children from child labor. So a lot of different statutes, federal statutes, that are aimed at addressing this issue. There are also plenty of state statutes. Since 2003, I apologize, I'm just double checking my Q&A widget because the way this is set up on my end, I can't necessarily see what people are asking. Okay, coming back to state statutes. So since 2003, every state has enacted laws establishing criminal penalties for traffickers seeking to profit from forced labor or sexual servitude. The really important thing to note about state statutes is they are different state to state, as is always the case. So the definition of traffickers might differ between two states. The definition of trafficking. Some states might permit businesses to be prosecuted, others do not. The elements of the actual crime vary state by state. So to the extent that anyone has questions about state-specific laws, please let us know and we will be happy to follow up. But again, it's just you need to know where you're operating and look at the specific state statutes. A lot of states have also enacted laws that require the posting of information regarding the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Locations for posting include basically anywhere that you're going to have agricultural laborers, lodging facilities, adult entertainment services, airports, train stations and bus stations, hospitals, and urgent care centers, rest areas, truck stops, restaurants, bars, nightclubs, so on. So to the extent that your owner operate any of those businesses, it's really important to know whether or not there is a burden to post this information. And again, that varies state by state. So if you have questions, please let us know. And there's one particular state statute I want to talk about, and of course it comes from California, as they all do. The California Transparency and Supply Chains Act. So what this act does is it requires businesses to disclose on their website their efforts to eradicate human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor from the direct supply chains. This act applies to companies that meet all three of the following. So the company has to do business in California. It has to have annual worldwide gross receipts exceeding $100 million. And the company has to be identified as a retail seller or manufacturer on its California state tax return. And I'm sure all the attorneys in the room are immediately thinking, what does do business mean? It's a pretty contested term. Luckily, it's not the kind of amorphous concept that we would talk about in a personal jurisdiction setting. The statute actually very clearly defines what doing business equals. And you can meet that definition one of three ways. The business has sales in California that exceed $500,000 or 25% of the business's total sales, whichever is less. It has retail property and tangible property in California that exceeds $50,000 in value or 25% of the business's total real property and tangible personal property, whichever is less. Or if the company pays compensation in California that exceeds $50,000 or 25% of the total compensation paid by the business, whichever is less. So if you meet one of those three definitions, you are doing business in California per this statute. But remember, that doesn't necessarily mean you're subject to this act. You still have to meet these other two requirements. In California, I believe that they publish every year the list of entities that are subject to this act. And I believe right now, I think it's roughly 3,200 companies meet these definitions. The important thing about this act, it does not require businesses to implement any new policies. It just requires them to clearly identify on their websites so that consumers can look at it, what they are doing. And there are 5 topics of disclosure. Those topics are verification, audit, certification, internal accountability, and training. Let's look at these in depth. So verification. The company has to explain what it has done to evaluate and address the risk of human trafficking and slavery in supply chains. For audit, the company has to confirm whether it has audited suppliers to determine whether they comply with the company's standards for trafficking and slavery to the extent they exist. Certification, has the company certified that materials incorporated into products comply with applicable laws? Internal accountability, does the company hold employees and contractors accountable? And then training, does the company provide training on human trafficking and slavery? And remember, the answer, I mean, a company could answer no to all of these, and it is complied with the act. The issue is that concerned consumers can go look on the website and see what the company is doing and then bring their business out, which is the goal of this act. Okay, so apart from federal law and state law here in the U.S., companies need to be mindful, you know, if you're exporting to other countries or if you're doing business abroad. Other countries have very robust anti-trafficking laws, particularly in Europe, but they are more and more common. You know, every year more countries enact anti-trafficking laws, and they look anything like the Trafficking Victim Protection Act here, or the California Act, or you know, any other variety of methods for combating human trafficking. So it's just important to know what countries where you're doing business, and if you want to discuss those countries' laws, please let us know, and we'll be happy to look into it. And then on the horizon, as I just mentioned, more and more countries are enacting laws to combat human trafficking, and then both the federal government here, additional states, and then a variety of other countries are considering adopting rules similar to California's acts. Say that a couple of bills, more than a couple, I think quite a few bills have been introduced with respect to addressing the supply chain issue on a national scale. I believe that the majority of them so far have died in committee, but people continue to propose these bills, and so I think that this is something that we're probably going to see on a national scale within the next 5 to 10 years. Okay, so now that we've talked about all of the applicable laws, let's talk about how your business is implicated. So first here, we have supply chains, and obviously we have the entire California Act that's aimed at addressing the supply chain issue. So there are really two things to think about when you're talking about supply chains. One, you have to look at where the materials are coming from, right? And then on top of that, you have to look at who are the workers that are harvesting the raw materials? Who are the workers that are creating the products? So as we think about those weavers in Africa, that's a supply chain issue. And there have been a lot of supply chain issues in the news lately, and I have two off the top of my head. So anyone who's been reading the news has probably read about the recent reporting on the chocolate industry. And pretty much every major chocolate supplier has an issue with its supply chains. And the reason for this is that the supply chains are very complex. Cocoa beans are coming from a variety of different sources. And my understanding is that most of these companies, they can only identify somewhere like 25% of where their beans are coming from, which means that 75% could be coming from plantations, anywhere on the globe that are relying on child labor. Is a really big issue in that industry, or straight out forced labor. So really, if you have a complicated supply chain, it makes it far more difficult to determine whether you're relying on any forced labor. So pay close attention to where the products are coming from and what you can do to try to identify risks. Are they coming from particularly notorious countries or issues of that nature? The other way that your business might be impacted, so is your direct labor forces. And I think the thing that most people think about, if you think of, in this context, is the first one that comes to mind would be essentially sweatshops in South America or Southeast Asia, and we hear about those in the news quite recently. Just in the past couple of years, there was an issue where people who were essentially working in a sweatshop all perished when I believe that there was a fire. So it's a huge problem globally, and it could potentially also be a problem here in the U.S. So, pay attention to your labor forces. Where, if you rely on contractors, where are they coming from? Labor forces used by your affiliates, your subsidiaries. The industries that are most likely to be impacted by this: hospitality industry, hotels, lodging facilities, farms, plantations, orchards, anywhere where you have agricultural laborers. This is a really big issue, and I say that it's a very big issue here in the U.S. Factories, massage parlors, and then restaurants, bars, and nightclubs. So just knowing, all the different ways that you employ people. Are they direct employees? Are they contractors? These are all issues that you need to pay attention to. The next one is, if you are in the business of providing services that could be used by traffickers. A lot of examples. I've just listed a few here. So hotel and lodging facilities. This is a big issue with sexual exploitation. Airlines, buses, rails, and taxi companies. To the extent that people are actually trafficked across borders or from one state to another, they're using methods to transport those people. Internet platforms. I mentioned this earlier. Dating websites have made it much easier for people to traffic both men and women. So if you're providing a platform that traffickers are using, that potentially exposes you to liability. And then banking services, which I mentioned earlier with respect to the Banking Secrecy Act. Most large financial institutions have taken very robust steps to combat money laundering, and so that's going to be addressing a lot of the trafficking issues. What that has resulted in is traffickers taking their business elsewhere to smaller, like mom and pop shops. So your credit unions, your local community banks, other money services businesses that don't really have as robust of a platform or as robust of a identification and mitigation policy for money laundering. So they've essentially just moved their business elsewhere, and it is creating issues. So for those of you who are involved in the financial services industry, if you're a big financial institution, this is probably already addressed, but just keep these things in mind. And the fourth one I have on here is entertainment. I mentioned earlier that even if you have a minor who's technically consenting, someone who has applied for a job here in the U.S. and gotten a job, and that person is hired as an adult entertainer, that is technically trafficking. Now, obviously, there is a knowledge component that goes on, but I just want to highlight that to the extent that a company or people within the company are relying on some type of adult entertainment for either clients or their own employees, just know that there is exposure there. And then the fifth category I have here, government contractors. And there is a very robust regulatory framework that governs government contractors. I'm not going to get into it here because just last week we presented another webinar aimed specifically at government contractors. Jana Russ presented that, and it's called Managing Contractors Combating Trafficking Compliance. I highly recommend that you go watch that webinar if you are either, if you're currently a government contractor or if that's a space that you're looking to go into. highly, highly regulated. So definitely go check out that webinar. Okay, so as we've discussed, a variety of ways that your business might be implicated, and I don't mean to suggest that these are all of them, but these are just some things to think about. Let's go look at some example cases. And I've picked a few that I think are particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. So these first two cases we have here, Barry Quarto versus Industrial Personnel and Albato versus French Concepts Bakery. In both of these cases, people from foreign countries were brought into the U.S. legally under E-2 visa. And then they were forced to work, in the case of Barry Quarto, they were forced to work long hours in grueling conditions for less than minimum wage. With Albato, forced to work very long hours with very little pay. And in those cases, even though the people were brought to the U.S. legally and they were actually paid, they were still victims of forced labor. The Barry Quarto case that settled for an undisclosed amount. With Albato, that was over a $15 million judgment apportioned among 11 plaintiffs. So very, very big numbers. Next, I have Riccio versus McLean. This is a case that is currently, well, this particular case went up to the Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, and the court permitted a trafficked woman who had been held captive in a motel room to bring suit against the motel. The facts of this case, the woman apparently was held there for an extended period of time, might have asked for help, clearly was in distress, and no one at the motel took any steps to help her, and the Court of Appeals said that that was sufficient to allow the case to go forward against the motel, and that case is ongoing. Francisco versus Susano, 10th Circuit case, and the 10th Circuit held that because the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is essentially a civil remedy that sounds in tort, punitive damages are available. And there was a judgment entered of over $1 million. The 9th Circuit has since followed suit and allowed punitive damages. So, actual damages for exploitation can add punitives on top of it, and companies or individuals could be looking at very, very big numbers. Mitchell versus the City of Montgomery, and I've included this one just because I think it's very interesting, and it highlights the just the scope of this statute. So in this case, impoverished individuals they were essentially picked up for failing to pay traffic tickets. They pled poverty basically, and they were nonetheless jailed and charged a $50 a day jailing fee. Obviously, if you can't pay off the tickets, you probably can't pay off the tickets plus your jailing fees. So their only option was to perform what they described as fairly disgusting janitorial work in the jail to pay off their debt. And they brought a claim, and that one did not go to judgment. It settled, but the settlement included very sweeping changes of the city's bail practices. So this statutory framework is far-reaching. The last one I have here, Medicall versus GEO Group. There was a group of diverse immigrant detainees, and they were able to certify a class action for forced labor against a for-profit incarceration company. And this case is ongoing. I think it's really important to note here that these people, they come, although they're all detainees, they're all of diverse backgrounds, and they were not necessarily required or forced to do the same types or amount of work, but the conditions in which they were held, the judge determined that that was sufficient to certify a class. So we've already talked, I just mentioned punitive damages. Certifying a class, this gives this statute significantly more teeth. And I think that's really the big point that I want to make about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is it has teeth. It has teeth in a lot of different ways. Now, to date, there have not been that many claims brought, at least not that many civil claims brought under the Act. I want to say the grand total is somewhere between 200 and 300. However, I do not think that those low numbers, or that those numbers will stay low. I think that we're going to see a lot more litigation out of this statutory framework going forward. In particular, I would think that enterprising plaintiff firms are going to get their hands on it. And we just haven't seen a lot of that yet. But so I just want everyone to be very aware this could potentially be a very big issue going forward. And the damages are already, class actions, punitive damages, actual damages. It's potentially looking at a lot of money. And I apologize if I've received questions. I'm trying to check the Q&A widget, and I'm toggling back and forth. It doesn't look like I have yet, but if I've missed something, I'm very, very sorry. Please feel free to email me after we get done, and I will be happy to answer your questions. Okay, so now that we've discussed, a variety of ways that companies might be implicated in human trafficking and some sample cases, what can companies do to identify and eradicate human trafficking? And so I've condensed this all into one slide, and really this is the entire point of the CLE, but the reason that I have this condensed is because I can provide some general guidelines, and we can talk about this, but really what your company needs to be doing is going to depend on the industry you're in, what your particular company is doing, and then the states and the countries that you are operating in. So we're going to go through just general guidelines, but to the extent that this is an issue that you want to address going forward, let's talk, because there's a lot that goes into this. The first point I have on this slide is really, you need to be implementing internal policies, and you need to be training your people on those internal policies. And these policies should address the things that we've been talking about for the past 40 minutes. So the first is your supply chain. Essentially, you need to be conducting risk management analysis. Where are your goods coming from? Where are parts being manufactured? Where are finished goods being assembled? Are they countries with human rights violations? Are your supply chains complex such that you don't know where everything is coming from? The first step is essentially, what are your internal policies to address this going to be? Can you be doing on-site inspections? Can you be training people on the red flags? The countries where there are human rights violations. So there are a lot of things to think about specifically with respect to supply chains. Next one is investigate employment practices within your own company. And again, this is not just, if you happen to have a factory over in Bangladesh. I strongly recommend that you investigate the practices over there. But also, is there a factory here in the U.S.? And do you suspect that that factory is relying primarily on undocumented workers? Those scenarios are ripe for trafficking. And things that you can pay specific attention to. There are a lot of things you can look at employment-wise. So restrictions on workers' freedom of movement, withholding of wages or identity documents, physical or sexual violence, threats and intimidation, or fraudulent debt from which workers cannot escape. So all good, those are obvious red flags. You train people to look for them, identify them, and report them. Additional things, so look for employers that provide food and housing rather than wages, or employers that fail to pay the mandated minimum wages, either outright or through discounting or other offsetting. And the minimum wage issue, it's interesting how that plays out. Typically, that you're going to be looking at the minimum wages in whatever country or state that person happens to be in. But I have seen some kind of interesting arguments under the TVPA about applying U.S. minimum wages. And I think in most cases, the answer is going to be look to the country where the work is being performed, except to the extent that the country is, is just rife with human trafficking violations, in which case that probably will not apply. And then one additional point. Sorry, I have it as a separate point here, but it's what I'm just talking about. Determine whether the workers are making mandated minimum wages. Again, start with the country of origin, the country where that person is actually working, and then just make sure there are no red flags. The next one, also following up on the same point, what are the red flags? And this could be, like I just discussed, it could be a general red flag about trafficking. So, we looked at that map earlier and saw that India was the worst in terms of the number of people who are victims of forced labor. So if you are relying or outsourcing work to India, make sure you're paying attention to any red flags that are identified with specific to India, because we already know it's a problem. Pay attention to particular, not just countries that have been identified as particular problems, but also companies. There are watch lists out there that can identify people and entities that you probably do not want to be doing business with because it could expose you to liability. Additionally, there are a lot of industry-specific red flags. And I've listed on here, one of the red flags for banking, which is a funnel account, is essentially an account that handles numerous cash deposits from multiple locations. But there are lots of things that banks are required to pay attention to, including just frequent transactions inconsistent with the expected activity or line of business. I mean, that is a red flag, and there are lots of these that have been identified specifically for the financial industry. Another one is the know your customer push, particularly in banking, so that you are, and I think this could apply really to any industry. Pay attention to who your customers are. Try to get to know them and try to identify what looks or appears to be suspicious activity. And also, so these are things that can be implemented internally, and I mentioned train your people. That's really important. Train everyone on how to identify this stuff, what they should be looking for, who they should be reporting it up to, and then very importantly, hold them accountable. So what happens if they do not report it? Because remember, if an employee learns of something, or say an employee actually actively knows that something is going on and is profiting from some type of forced labor, that employee's knowledge is imputed to the employer under the TVPA. So a good way to avoid this is to have really robust internal policies, train people, and make sure you're holding them accountable so that you can show it, if someone really, if someone is profiting from some type of illegal activity, the company has done everything to try to avoid that and prevent that. And that could potentially protect you from liability. Not necessarily, but potentially. Another option is to build compliance obligations into your agreements with other entities. So anyone that you are purchasing goods or services for, can you require them to certify? So, for instance, we go back to those the five issues identified in the California in Supply Chains Act. So the certification, the auditing, the verification, holding employees accountable, and training people. So can you build those requirements into your contracts with entities you're doing business with? I don't mean to suggest that this is necessarily easy, but it is one way of helping to minimize liability. And then finally, if you're in any of those industries that I identified earlier where states have required posting of the National Trafficking Victims Protection Hotline, just know what your state laws are and what your posting obligations are and what information you have to be providing. And again, if anyone has questions about those, we would be happy to give you, state information. So these are just an outline. So, a very, very broad description of things that companies can be doing. Again, very industry specific, company specific, and then state/country. So if you want to start implementing some of these changes, please come talk to us, and we'll help you do that and tell you the most effective ways to go about it. All right. So legal and social ramifications of non-compliance. I really wish that the goal of not trafficking people or their organs would be enough for people to maybe implement some of these policies, but it's just not the case. So we have a lot of fun legal and social ramifications for failure to comply. Starting with civil penalties. So under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, we discussed earlier that the victims can bring lawsuits in U.S. federal court against any U.S. entities or people for knowingly benefiting from a venture where they should have known that there was trafficking. So that is very costly litigation. As we mentioned earlier, go after actual damages, punitive damages, and they get attorney's fees. And on top of that, they have the option of trying to certify a class. So the potential for civil liability is huge. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think that we are going to see an uptick in these cases going forward. There are plenty of criminal penalties as well. Steep fines for, depending on the type of violation, restitution to the victims, and then prison. So the prison sentences run anywhere from, I would say, 20 years to life. So the TVPA, certainly in terms of creating the civil cause of action, has teeth. It also has a lot of teeth on the criminal side. Additional issues, loss of export licenses. As I mentioned earlier, if you have specific questions about specifically about export licenses, again, Robert Shapiro he's very, very knowledgeable about this, and we can really get into the weeds on this issue. So please let us know if you have any questions. And then the last one I have up here, loss of revenue due to social stigma. This is actually, it seems, I think a lot of people probably discount this point, and they shouldn't. So for instance, the entire California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, that statute is designed to give consumers knowledge about the goods that they are buying and whether or not they are likely to have been produced with forced labor. It seems like every single generation cares more and more about this issue. So as I mentioned earlier, if you remember the knowledge about all the sweatshops, remember all those articles coming out in the 90s, and my parents changing their purchasing habits. And the investigative journalism regarding the chocolate factory or the chocolate industry that has come out recently. I've been reading a lot of reports about fishing, which is particularly interesting. So there have been some lawsuits about where the fish that is used to make pet food, where it is coming from, because the fishing industry is particularly, it's very easy to traffic people in that industry. And what happens is that people are more or less kidnapped as children or young adults, and they are held as slaves on these boats, often until they die. This is very well documented, and there's an entire global action protocol called GAPFISH aimed at curbing this. But consumers are more and more paying attention to where these problems in the supply chains are, and they are bringing their business elsewhere. As I was putting this together, I was just curious, and I looked at what types of apps are available and for consumers to determine if their goods are likely to be made with forced labor, and there were 5 or 6 different apps. So you literally, you can walk into a store, scan the product, and it will tell you the likelihood it's made with forced labor, and a consumer can then go buy something else. So this really, truly is a big driver, and it really, every single generation, so I'm the millennial generation, on the old end of the millennial generation, but it's a big issue for us. It is a huge issue for the I generation. So it's going to be more and more of a problem. So if the fear of stiff criminal penalties and the cost of civil lawsuits was not enough, you could also just lose all of your customers. Okay, so now that we've had a very general discussion, let's go back to the scenarios that we talked about earlier. The first one, I'll reread this. So you have the U.S. company in the business of selling goods made from cloth woven in Togo, Africa. One of the employees from the U.S. company has reason to believe that the weavers are poorly paid and forced to work long hours in grueling conditions. Do the weavers in Togo have a claim against the U.S. company? And I think, based on everything that we've discussed so far, the answer here seems to be yes. The company, the knowledge of that employee can be imputed to the employer. The employer is knowingly benefiting from this venture. They are purchasing the goods, but they are presumably saving money purchasing goods that were cost less to make with forced labor. And they had reason to know, or this employer directly knew, that these weavers were poorly paid and forced to work long hours in grueling conditions, and all of that. Now, whether that specifically amounts to forced labor, that's a question of fact that we can argue over. But those facts lead me to believe that this would be forced labor. So this would be a clear case of a potential claim under the TVPA. Now, again, the hurdle is that the weavers in sub-Saharan Africa would have to know that they have this potential remedy in the U.S. and manage to get that claim filed here in the U.S., which is very unlikely in today's circumstances. But again, that doesn't mean that those cases are not going to, there's not going to be an uptick as people realize more and more the teeth that this statute has. Okay, so number 2. A minor uses a dating website to elicit customers for commercial sex. Is the website liable for trafficking? And I mentioned earlier that it doesn't matter that this minor is out doing this, voluntarily. Commercial sex involving a minor is trafficking. But of course, the issue here is the website knowingly benefiting. I assume even if it's a free website, the people using it generate ad revenue and that type of thing, so they are knowingly benefiting. But should they know it's a venture that involves trafficking? And here, that's a really murky question, right? So does the website even know that this minor is eliciting customers for sex? That's a big question. I mean, it depends on what that person is actually using, what they are stating and posting on the website. And then also, does the website know that that person is actually a minor? And so I think this is a gray area. My assumption is likely they would not know, but there could be liability there. So again, for anyone who is providing internet platforms that could potentially be used in this way, this is an issue to pay attention to. Our third example, and this is pulled from the recent news, the ICE raid in Mississippi. So we have a U.S. poultry processing plant opts to hire undocumented workers for significantly less pay in order to save on labor costs. The workers have a claim against the factory. This is another one where I think that this would be a gray area. So if we go back, find my slide. Okay, so let's go back to our definition, right? So in that case, do they meet the definition of trafficking? So they are recruiting people, and they are, potentially harboring people. I honestly, I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know all the facts of the that recent raid. But they're certainly recruiting people for work, right? They've not been abducted. There's no fraud. There's no deception, at least unless they were lying about what they would pay. But there could be potential coercion, right? So these workers, they are vulnerable populations. They might not have a lot of other employment options. So the question is whether or not they were coerced or if they were deceived into taking those jobs. And then for the purpose of unlawful exploitation, and the scenario says that they are paying them less, the fact that you are paying them less is a major red flag, but this is also, does it amount to forced labor? So this one is truly very, very tricky because I think in all three regards, it's a gray area. But an argument could be made that those undocumented workers are victims of trafficking. The last time I checked, I hadn't seen any lawsuits come through on that basis, and there won't be any. But the reality is the response here in the U.S. was to round up those workers and not to prosecute the people running the company. So I don't ultimately know how that one will fall out or what the fallout will be of that one, but it's happening here in the United States, and this is a really good example of potential forced labor. I have to go back to my slide. Okay. So this is our very brief overview of trafficking in supply chains, labor forces, and more. Looking at the Q&A widget, I don't think I've seen any questions. If anyone has any questions, please let me know. You can put them through now, and we will track all of them, and we will get them answered in due course. Again, it's super industry specific. So if you are looking to put together, internal policies and procedures to prevent it, please come talk with us, and we'll be happy to help you with that, or just any general questions you have about this, because it is a huge problem globally, and we're starting to pay attention to it more and more. So I expect to see an uptick in these cases. All right, and like I said, here's my email address. Please feel free to reach out to me or give me a call. I'd be happy to talk through this with you. It's a very, very interesting and very unfortunate reality of today's global environment. So I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. And one reminder, so as we close this seminar, reminder about the certification. So as you go click through on your certification, make sure that you've checked all the boxes, you've done everything that you need there, because as soon as you move on to the survey, you can't go back. And want to make sure that everyone gets their certification. So thank you for participating in the webinar. And then please complete the survey located in the widget at the bottom of your screen. Thanks. Goodbye.
Hey, Audrey, it's Irene.